Stellan Vinthagen is a scholar and activist, a professor of sociology and the inaugural Endowed Chair in the Study of Nonviolent Direct Action and Civil Resistance at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He is editor of the Journal of Resistance Studies and co-leader of the Resistance Studies Group at the University of Gothenburg in his native Sweden. With a deep dedication to conflict transformation and civil disobedience, he has authored and edited numerous books, putting out his latest, A Theory of Nonviolent Action, How Civil Resistance Works. Well, welcome, Dr. Vinthagen. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Where are you calling in from?
From Amherst, Massachusetts. I'm working at the University of Massachusetts.
So you are filling some big shoes right now. You are the first male-identifying spotlight guest, so the pressure is on, for sure.
All right.
So I always ask every guest when we start these interview series, I was introduced to you through David Hart, who is our co-director at Nonviolence International, and I'd love to know how you got involved with the organization.
I would say it was probably when I met Mubarak Awad at a meeting, and then I visited for a talk with David. And then I think it's been going on from then, having contact and communication. I learned about the work Nonviolence International have been doing in developing a list of different tactics, and so on. So I've been impressed by the work.
You have dedicated your whole life, both academic and personal. You've been imprisoned a handful of times, so the dedication is there to the civil resistance and nonviolent tactics. So where did that interest stem from or begin?
Well, I'm grown up in a family with some hippie alternative values. So I learned about Gandhi very early on from my family, my father particularly. We were vegetarians. My father refused to go to the military in the conscription in Sweden. My mother has been giving protection to refugees. So I think in that way, I got the values very early.
Yeah.
I became an activist when I was 14, 15.
So you worked extensively internationally. You worked both at the University of Amherst in Massachusetts and the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. I'm interested to know, is there a real noticeable difference between the way that the topics that you introduce in the classroom are received by the students?
When I'm teaching in Asia or in Africa, the realities of what the students are going through.
Wow.
But yeah, teaching the difference between Scandinavia or Northern Europe and the United States is also a big difference. I find that the students that I have they're tending to be engaged and interested in political issues. They choose my classes because of their interest, I think. But I find one thing that is kind of interesting of a difference is that the students in the US are less aware when it comes to class issues, and much more aware when it comes to race issues, if I compare with my students in Scandinavia.
Wow. I mean, so just the disparities between socioeconomic status for the classes.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. I mean, that's interesting to me because the United States is such a capitalist country that you'd think that
Right.
that would be more aware of just how great that gap is between the very rich and the very poor.
Yeah. So, I mean, students can be aware of that these kind of differences exist in society in general, right?
Mm-hmm.
But to understand how class as a socioeconomic category operates and how it matters in society, I would say it's a big difference. where the American students are not really understanding that very sophisticated, but they're very much more aware when it comes to race, much more than my Scandinavian students.
Wow. Having written on these topics for your entire professional career, what do you believe is the greatest barrier to peace and nonviolence in today's day and age?
I would say that that there's way too few people that understand the power that lies within organized, ordinary people in doing nonviolent civil disobedience, direct actions. Too few people understand the power that lies within that. I find that it's kind of astonishing that even within the field of peace studies, there is very little comparable research that is being done on looking on how nonviolent social movements have overthrown governments and created change. And there's even less understanding of how the constructive program that Gandhi talked about, what kind of importance that could have in creating a different society. So I would say that the power of nonviolence as applied by ordinary people is still the kind of key thing that people don't really see and don't use fully. So even when people apply it, it's like it's a kind of a superficial knowledge. If we would realize that, I think we could do so much.
That's a great segue to this next question that I have here. I have this quote that I absolutely love by Theodore Rosnek, and it says, "People try nonviolence for a week, and when it doesn't work, they go back to violence, which hasn't worked for centuries." So, in that same kind of spirit as what you're just discussing, like, what is your response to that?
It is that our knowledge about the struggle with nonviolent means is very superficial. There is this expectation that it is simple. It's a matter of going out on the street and then shouting our demands, and then things are happening. But we actually need to learn from other cases in history in other countries. We need to learn the different tactics. We need to apply it in a strategic way. We need to understand that there is a dynamic with different kinds of opponents. And we need to adapt to the different kinds of repression that different regimes are using against movements like that. And if we apply that kind of knowledge to it, based on experience and based on research, it's a very powerful way of struggling. But of course, if people are doing it in a sloppy way, superficial way, it won't work very well. But that would be the same if you would be using violence in a very superficial, sloppy way, and you would use the means that people applied 2,000 years ago with an arrow and that kind of ways of struggling. The bow and arrow is not really the means of struggle with armed means that is happening today, right? In any kind of war. The same with nonviolence, it needs to be developed. We need to base it on knowledge when we're doing that kind of struggle. So I would say research, learning, training, education, organizing, that takes time and that takes effort.
Wow. I've never had someone point that out before, that, the ways in which we wage war and violence are evolving, but the ways that we are waging nonviolence maybe is still a little bit delayed behind that.
Yeah.
Definitely less money being poured into the nonviolence probably than, unfortunately, with defense spending.
Right.
And wow.
Yeah, and you know, when you think about it like that, it's kind
Yeah.
of fascinating how powerful even a superficial application of nonviolence can be in overthrowing even militarized governments, right? So
Yep.
then imagine what would happen if we would have more more of knowledge of actually of how to apply this, right? So I think there is such an incredible potential when it comes to organized nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience, um, which is proven by that people are sort of effective even with their superficial application of it.
Mm-hmm. Have you found over like your teaching career that there is an increased interest in nonviolent work? Like, are you finding
Oh, yeah.
it's on the rise?
Absolutely, clearly.
Yeah.
But I would say that it's on the rise in the way that more people are aware of it, more people are interested, but I still think it's kind of not going on the depth in terms of really trying to learn more and going deeper in comparing with similar cases. Um, it's still um, quite much of using the very basic ideas. So I think we have much to do when it comes to acquiring the knowledge and the organizing and application of it. But yes, in the interest is growing clearly.
Why do you think that is? Like, why do you think that more people, is it just an awareness thing and an education, or just like it's been enough time that they've seen that nonviolent action has worked? Looking at the civil rights movement, or like Gandhi and Martin Luther King preaching nonviolence, and then having it juxtaposed with very armed, very violent reactions and movements. What do you think has sparked that?
It's mostly the very astonishing events and processes that have demonstrated for people the power of nonviolent resistance. So we saw with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the so-called socialist authoritarian societies in Eastern Europe, how they were breaking down in the face of ordinary people's nonviolent protest and resistance. We saw it in the so-called Arab Spring, but also with a much more mixed result, where some of the uprisings led to civil war situations or a return of military rule. But it has also been clear, I think, for people through the whole Occupy period that things can spread very quickly. People get inspired from each other, and there are enough of obvious success examples to kind of inspire people. I mean, what brought down the strongest fascist regime since the Second World War, the apartheid regime in South Africa? That was basically nonviolent resistance that made that happen. The armed resistance was very marginal, very irrelevant in actually creating the change in South Africa. So I think these cases during the 90s and the last 20 years have demonstrated for people the power of this.
As a parting thought, you work so closely with these students in the university setting. So what advice would you like to give to young people who may want to get involved in peace and nonviolence, but feel that the field is insurmountable, that these issues just cannot be met?
I would definitely say that there there is always a matter of beginning somewhere, and you should begin with smaller steps, with activism that is not so risky, that is more with your friends and in the neighborhoods where you are, and then focus on doing that and evaluate. Mm-hmm. And then when you evaluate, you learn what works and what doesn't, right? And then you can escalate from that, bring in more people, experiment with some other more high-risk actions, and you evaluate that. Mm-hmm. And by doing that, combining the practical experience where you try it out in issues and struggles where you care, where it's important for you, you will gain the kind of core knowledge that is needed here. And so that's absolutely doable. It doesn't have to be this super complicated where you have to learn so much beforehand before you do something. But then you will, if you do that, you experiment with practical and knowledge making, and you reflect. And I think that's what it's all about, reflecting on the practical experience. The thing with us professors at the university is just that we are paid to sit down and reflect. Mm-hmm. And that's a privilege. That's a privilege, right? Yes. But it can be a problem if that's divorced from the practical experience. Mm-hmm. Then you come up with the reflections that are not really relevant for activists.
Right. Thank you so much for doing this today. I am so glad that we worked out the Zoom hiccup.
Pleasure, and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, no, it was wonderful. It was excellent to get to talk to you. Thank you so much.
If you think these conversations are important and would like to see them continue, please show your support for the work that Nonviolence International does by subscribing to this channel and checking out our website, Twitter, and Facebook page. Thank you so much for stopping by. We hope to see you next time.